If you would this morning, please open up your Bibles to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We are continuing on in this sermon series from the book of Thessalonians, this sermon series deals all with hope. And that's why I've called the sermon series Hope Restored. Because I believe that for a lot of us, we have to have a renewal of our hope. Hope is the fuel to keep going. You remember the definition that I've been giving you week after week? Maybe you put it to memory. I hope that by the time this series is done, that this definition sticks. But we've defined hope as the confident expectation that better days are ahead. That's what hope is. It's the belief that maybe next week will be better than this week. That yesterday was pretty rough. Today's not going great. Maybe tomorrow will be better. That's what hope is. And the ultimate hope that you and I have is found in the fact that Jesus promised to come again. That He's going to return to this earth and He's going to take those who've been faithfully following Him back home to heaven to be with Him forever and ever. And so what greater hope could we look forward to than that day? But even more than just looking forward to the coming of Christ, you and I have been called to have life in this world abundantly. That's what Jesus Christ came to do, that He came to give life and give life abundantly. And so abundant life begins when you accept Jesus Christ. And so the hope that you have is not just a futuristic thing waiting for heaven to happen. It's a hope that is here and now for you. And I want your fuel tank of hope to be refilled. And so that's why we're in 1 Thessalonians, and that's why we've been talking about this. Today we're going to be talking about hope in relationships. The title of this morning's sermon is Hope for Broken Relationships. Do you have any of those? Do you have any broken relationships here on earth? Where maybe you used to be really close. You used to be intimate with somebody and have daily conversations with somebody. And now that seems like that was so long ago because you don't even talk to that person, let alone see them. And if you do see them out and about, well, it's very awkward and you mind your business and they mind their business. Do you have any relationships that are broken? Well, this morning, I want to encourage you that all throughout this morning's sermon, that you think about that person, that you think about that situation. As painful, as uncomfortable as it may be, I want you to put that at the forefront of your thinking here today, because I believe God's Word would have something to say about the broken relationships that exist in your life. I can tell you from my standpoint that certainly God has been working on my heart with the broken relationships that I have as I've been studying this sermon this week. Now, before we get to before we can get to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, I have to kind of give you the context so you can fully understand what's going on. In order to do that, I've got to yet once again refer to Acts chapter 17. You see, Acts chapter 17 is the very first time that the Apostle Paul goes to visit the city of Thessalonica, which was up here in the bay. And man, things were going great. The church that he had planted and lives were being changed, were thriving and going well. And it seemed like, man, life was just going peachy keen. That is until there were some Jews who were angry at what Paul was doing because they thought that he was blaspheming. How dare he say that Jesus is God? There's only one God. And these Jews didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And here Paul is in Thessalonica preaching Jesus Christ. So they decide what they're going to do is they're going to put an end to this false teaching. And so they decide they're going to try to kill Paul. Paul gets word of this. And the church in Thessalonica, some of the brethren, it says, send him away to Berea by night. They get him out of the city as fast as possible. Well, that became kind of a point of contention for the people in Thessalonica because they felt a little bit abandoned. Paul was one day here in my life, involved in it, talking, preaching, teaching. He was my friend. The next day, he's gone with not even as much as a goodbye, with no explanation. And so that kind of brings us a little bit here to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. what he's doing as he's writing this letter then to the Thessalonians is he is explaining to them, telling them what has happened. Because after he went to Berea, he then comes down here to Athens with Silas and Timothy. And they're there for a little bit, and eventually what's going to happen is that Paul, Silas, and Timothy will go to Corinth, where Paul will write this letter to the Thessalonians as he's in Corinth. But what we're going to soon see happening here is that he's writing this letter to kind of explain to them what had happened, because he didn't get a chance to say goodbye. And that left a lot of them scratching their heads. Was Paul just here for our money? Does he even care about us? Was it all just a facade? And so Paul is writing 1 Thessalonians, and we're going to dive into chapter 3 in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to ask you this question. Why is it that relationships sometimes suffer and split? You ever wondered that? If you have a broken relationship, and I'm guessing that you do because we all have them, why is it that that relationship got damaged? What happened? Chances are, a high chance is, that relationship is no longer the same because there's been a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of events. Has that happened to you? Things were going great in your relationship until they weren't. And now I have to address the issue with my mom and my spouse, or my son and my sister, my friend, my boss, my coworker. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of things that have happened. Let me just kind of give you an illustration. I've shared this illustration and this story with you before, but I think it fits once again to this situation. Back a long time ago, I'm talking 2005, when Lindsay and I were living in what is now known as the Brody House, the parsonage over here. We were living out here at Burnside. I was the youth minister. And Chris Reynolds and Bobby Joe, he was the senior minister, and they were living in the parsonage over here to the left. So we lived all the way over there in that white house, and they lived over here in this white house, the ranch-style house. And I was the youth minister, and I had a youth trip function, a youth trip that we were getting ready to take the next day, and it was, I believe it was either late winter or early spring. And I didn't want to walk all the way over to go get the church van, which at that time we had it stored in the west parking lot over here at the very end. And so I convinced Lindsay, I said, hey, would you ride over with me so I can go get the van and we'll drive it back to the house and I'll have it ready then for the trip for tomorrow. She said, yeah, sure, let's do that. So we load up in the car, the Plymouth Breeze, that green Plymouth Breeze that we had, and we drove from the youth parsonage over here to go get the van. And things were going fine. We're just sitting there chatting. It was just a short trip, doing about 15, 20 miles an hour, nothing crazy. And we weren't even buckled in. It's going to be a short trip over there and back. Well, it was about this time of year, and all winter long, the parking lot had been plowed. And I don't even know who was plowing at that point, but as sometimes happens, when you plow, you sometimes get gravel when you plow the snow. Well, the snow had melted, and left behind were these remnants of gravel piles that were also caught up in the plowed snow. So all throughout our parking lot over here, kind of scattered, were kind of mounds of gravel. So we were driving over there, and it was in the late afternoon, early evening. The sun was setting in the west, and we're driving along. And we're just having a conversation. Well, the next thing that I know, wham! And Lindsay, she's sitting here talking to me, and all of a sudden her head just hits the dash, and I'm like, what just happened? And I open the car door, and sure enough, that Plymouth Breeze was right on top of one of those mounds of gravel that had been left there as a remnant from the snowplow. And I didn't see it because the sun was right here in my eyes, and we're just, I didn't even think about it possibly being there. Well, unbeknownst to me until later that week, Bobby Joe Reynolds, who was Chris's wife, was over here doing dishes, and she was looking out the kitchen sink window, and she sees me just making a beeline for this gravel pile, and she's thinking to herself, what is Mark doing? And sure enough, I hit that gravel pile. She thought I was intentionally, maybe watched one too many episodes of the Dukes of Hazzard, and was going to jump and ramp over that gravel pile. You see, from her perspective, there was a misinterpretation of events. She thought, what's Mark doing, that lunatic? He's jumping. And from my perspective, that's not what I intended at all. It was an accident. But that's sometimes how things happen, is there is a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of events that have happened. A hurt was caused. And the person thinks that you meant to hurt them on purpose when in fact you never meant to hurt them, and now the relationship is somehow damaged. I want you to think about the times that you've lost hope in a relationship, or even in life in general. I believe that most often when we lose hope, there's a person in our life with whom we have a relationship that's been damaged. Think about that just for a moment. Something has happened in a relationship with a person that we care deeply about, and that is so often tied together with the hope that is supposed to exist within our lives. When my friendships are strong, when my marriage is healthy, when I'm getting along with my coworkers, life's pretty good. But when those relationships are strained, when they're suffering, when they're damaged, everything else seems to just kind of completely go off the rails. Am I right? Every relationship is either helping or hindering your hope. And that's what Paul is really addressing as he writes this letter to the Thessalonians. There was this perceived hurt. Paul was here, he was planning a church, he was teaching, he was preaching, and then he just leaves. No explanation, no goodbye, and the people who he had been sharing Jesus with were confused, hurt, disillusioned, maybe even upset. And so he's writing this letter to address that. So are you in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3? Good. Keep a finger there. Flip back a page. We're going to start at the end of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 to get the context. I preached on these verses last week, but they also fit with what we're getting ready to talk about when we're talking about damaged relationships. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 17. But we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short while in person, not in spirit, were all the more eager with great desire to see your face. For we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and yet Satan hindered us. For who is our hope or joy or crown of exaltation? Is it not even you in the presence of our Lord Jesus at His coming? For you are our glory and joy. So you see what Paul's doing here at the end of chapter 2. He's like, yes, it's true, we had to leave. It's not what we wanted. It's not what we intended, but it's temporary. And I think it's quite interesting that Paul gives Satan the credit for keeping them apart. And that's where I want to start today. Paul says Satan flat out hindered us. If you're in the middle of a relationship that is strained, make a note of this. Look for Satan's involvement in that relationship that's been strained. Because Satan wants to drive a wedge between you and the people in your life that God wants you to be surrounded by. And so if your relationship is struggling, could it be that Satan is actively involved trying to destroy it? You see, Satan has a plan to strangle out hope in relationships. And I quickly want to talk about his strategy. There's 3 things that Satan is seeking to do with the relationships that God would seek to benefit you, that Satan is trying to put an end to those relationships. The first thing that Satan does as he's trying to strangle out the hope in those relationships is he distorts the thing in the relationship. Satan is really good at making a thing look like a thing when it isn't really a thing. And how many relationships have come to an end because of a perceived intentional offense? That's Satan twisting it and distorting it and blowing it up to be bigger than what it ever was meant to be. It's not what was intended. It's not what the motive was behind what was done. But Satan is twisting it and distorting it in your mind to perceive it as something more offensive than what it was intended to be. Does that make sense? He's distorting it. Second thing that Satan is going to do is he's going to divide. Satan uses that thing that isn't really a thing to create a wedge between people who should otherwise be together, who want to be together, but aren't together because of the thing that wasn't a thing that now has become a thing. And if Satan can distort and divide, do you know what's coming next? that relationship will be destroyed. And if Satan succeeds in distorting something that never was intended to happen, and if he can separate you long enough and squelch the communication between you long enough, if he can divide you from that person physically and emotionally, then there's a good chance that he's going to destroy that relationship. And if you're in the middle of a relationship that is struggling, first thing you do, look for Satan's involvement. Give him credit where credit's due. That's going to help go a long way to mend some relationships that are struggling. Secondly, if you're in the middle of a relationship that is strained, this is really hard, sacrifice and humble yourself. Man, that's so tough, isn't it? When it comes to a strained relationship, when it comes to a divide or a disagreement between two people who were once close, there is this deep temptation to dig your heels in and refuse to see your part in the problem that exists. We call it pride. And you've got to lay your pride aside. If you want the relationship, if you care more about the relationship than you care about being right, then you're going to have to lay your pride aside. And you're going to have to sacrifice and humble yourself. Well, I don't know why they're so upset. That's their problem. I didn't do anything wrong. If that's your attitude in that relationship, I got news for you. That relationship will never be resolved. Instead, sacrifice and humble yourself. And I think that's the lesson that we learn from Paul now as we come to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Listen to what he says. Verse 1. Therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith. You see what Paul just did here? It's truly amazing. Paul is sacrificing. He's sacrificing what it is he may want for the sake of the Thessalonians. Let me help you explain it a little bit better this way. So Paul, Silas, and Timothy leave Thessalonica, go to Berea, come down here to Athens. When they get to Athens, notice it's Paul and it's Silas. And he says, we thought that it would be best to send Timothy back to you, to check on you, to make sure you guys are okay. That's a sacrifice on Paul's behalf. Timothy was one of the greatest strengths Paul had in ministry. He was a huge help to him. And Paul is giving up Timothy for the sake of the Thessalonians. He's giving up what he wants in order to give them what they need. I want you to think about that. How many relationships would be on the path to restoration if you and I would be like, how about I give up what I need in order to give you what you need? How much healing would there be in a broken relationship? Instead of retreating into, well, this is what I expected from you and I didn't get that. Instead of doing that, how about we lay down what I need in order to give you what you need? That's the secret to keeping hope alive in relationships. Now, I was trying to figure out and wrestle with where to put this in the sermon, and I'm going to put it here. I don't know that it lands here, but this is where we're going to talk about it. You need to understand, there are some relationships in your life that needed to come to an end. Do you understand that? And do you recognize the difference between the ones that are needed to come to an end and the ones that God would want to continue in your life? Here's how you tell the difference. The ones that need to come to an end are the unhealthy relationships, the unproductive relationships, the harmful relationships, the sinful relationships. I'm not at all talking about trying to restore those types of relationships. Those needed to come to an end. I'm talking about the relationships that came to an unnecessary ending, because we all have plenty of those in our lives as well. Most often there is a separation and offense when there doesn't have to be any separation. Paul gave up one of his most treasured helps in his ministry for the sake of the Thessalonians. He sacrificed for the sake of restoring the relationship with the Thessalonians. Do you see it? Second thing that he did, he didn't just sacrifice, he humbled himself. Look at verses 3 through 5. So that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, and so it came to pass, just as you know. For this reason, when I could endure it no longer, I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. You see what he's doing here? He's like, look, we had to be removed from the situation for our own safety so that the ministry could continue. But it's not what I wanted. I wanted to be with you. And when I couldn't handle being apart from you any longer, when I had to find out how you guys were doing and getting along, I had to send Timothy to figure out how things were going, to see if you were mad at us, to see if you understood why we were no longer there, to see if you were thriving in your faith. And if you really want to restore a fractured relationship, do what Paul did. Take the first step in reaching out and trying to restore that relationship. And in order to do that, guess what? It's going to have to require some humility from you. You're going to have to swallow hard, take the first step, be the first to reach out, be the one to send the message or make the phone call. That's what's going to be needed from you in order to restore this broken relationship. Sacrifice and humble yourself. And that is a whole lot easier to preach than to live. Just telling you. So buckle up. If you want to restore some relationships that you are so sorry that that relationship came to an end, it's going to have to require some humility and sacrifice on your part. Third thing to do in the middle of a relationship that's been strained, and I think this is the most important, and this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time, choose hope over hurt. Don't let the hurt that you've experienced in the relationship hinder the hope that you have for the relationship. Choose hope over hurt. When you've been hurt in a relationship, it's way easy to focus on the hurt more than the hope. But when you do that, there is no hope of restoring that broken relationship. And there's three things in the text that Paul does to choose hope over hurt. Here's the first. Believe the best about that person and release the false impression. I want to say that again, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But you've got to believe the best about the person and let the false impression go. So as we're looking at our text here, there's a time gap between verse 5 and verse 6. Verse 5 says, "For this reason, when I could endure it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you, and our labor would have been in vain." He's talking about, I worried about you, I sent Timothy to go check in on you. Well, verse 6 is now Timothy has returned, and he gives a report, and listen to what is said by Timothy. "But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and your love, and that you always think kindly about us, longing to see us just as we long to see you." Paul talks and refers to the report that he received from Timothy as good news. In other words, Paul received a report that was better than he ever imagined it would be. He was a little bit afraid that they would be upset with them for leaving, that they would be hurt, that they wouldn't understand why they left, that they would think that their faith wasn't genuine or their motives were impure. And Paul believed the best. He was hoping for the best. I want you to think about the hurt that Paul might have felt himself. He might have had an option or opportunity to be offended by the Thessalonians. "Man, don't you guys know how much I cared and sacrificed for you? I had to have a full-time job when I was there just to make ends meet because we didn't want to be a burden to you. And I traveled all the way to Thessalonica just to be with you. I wasn't from Thessalonica. But I left friends and family behind in Jerusalem so I could be here with you. And now you're assuming some stuff about me that isn't true?" But that's not at all the feeling or the sentiment from which Paul is writing. He's letting go of the potential hurt and choosing to believe the best about the Thessalonians. And I love that Paul is so receptive and so open to Timothy's report. He believes the good news that's been told to him about the Thessalonians. Timothy comes back and he's like, they're not mad at all. Their faith is continuing in Jesus Christ, and they love us, and they can't wait to see us again. And Paul believes the good news of Timothy's report. How about you and I learn that lesson from Paul? How about we believe and assume the best about the people in our life, that relationships may not be where we want them to be, but we assume the best about them instead of automatically assuming the worst. How about we learn the lesson of, well, maybe that's not what they meant when they said that. Or maybe they were just having a bad day. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt my feelings. Maybe they don't even know that they hurt my feelings. How about we assume the best and let go of the false impression? Do you know why we're teaching this and you know why we're preaching this? It's because it's found in the Bible, you guys. It's so practical, God's Word is, that this lesson has been found in the Bible. Paul could have been hurt. He gave so much to the Thessalonians, and now they were questioning his love and devotion to them. He could have been hurt, but he chose not to be hurt. What a great model Paul is to us on how to repair damaged relationships. He didn't let hurt hinder his hope for being restored to the Thessalonians. Secondly, keep the big picture in focus. Focus on what matters most. Look at verses 7 and 8. Because when you're at odds with someone, when you're not getting along with someone, it's usually not as big as we make it out to be. And if we can choose to remember the big picture, then I think that's going to go a long ways to restore the relationship. And that's what Paul does in verses 7 and 8. He says, "For this reason, brethren, in all our distress and all of our affliction, we were comforted about you through your faith." See, Paul gets focused on the main thing. As soon as Paul finds out that their faith is fine, then he's fine. He's like, your faith is good, then we're good. That's what we care about most. And how often we forfeit hope in the false impression created by lack of communication. You know what I'm talking about? Think about the person that you're not on speaking terms with currently. Bring to mind someone who once was very dear to you and that now you're not speaking to one another except when only necessary. And maybe it's not nearly as bad as what you think it is. What Paul thought about the Thessalonians in the end was not proven to be true, but how often we forfeit hope in the false impression created by a lack of communication. And the misunderstanding only gets worse when there is no communication and that lingers on and on. If you don't address the weirdness in the relationship when it first starts getting weird, as soon as you start sensing that something's wrong with that person, as soon as you don't address that, the longer you let that weirdness go on, the worse it's going to be. Am I right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Am I seeing some heads here? If you don't address the weirdness, if you don't communicate, be like, hey, did I do something wrong? And just address it head on. The longer you let that thing linger, the worse it's going to be. Because lack of communication only makes our minds make some assumptions about one another that may not be true at all. Let me use an example that is totally hypothetical. I think you'll understand what I mean by this. Frank is a good friend of mine. But let's pretend just for a moment that Frank has not been in church for 6 weeks. And it's not because he's been sick or he even has any good reason to be gone. It's just that life is busy and 1 week turned into 2 and 2 turned into 4 and 4 turned into 6. And it's been a while since Frank's been in church. And so from Frank's perception, he might be like, I'm just going to avoid going to church because I think Mark's probably going to be mad at me for not showing up. Because Mark never even reached out to even say, hey, where you been, Frank, or what's going on? And furthermore, nobody even noticed that I was gone. There was this misinterpretation because of a lack of communication. And from my perspective, I could be like wondering, well, where's Frank? I should call him, but I don't want to call him because maybe Frank is mad at me. Maybe I said something in a sermon that he didn't like or didn't agree with, and I don't know how I'm going to handle that. Or maybe there was a decision that was made at our church that upset Frank. Do you see how lack of communication only makes the problem worse and worse in regards to a severed or broken relationship? How often we forfeit hope in the false impression because of a lack of communication. Don't let your mind assume the worst about people or situations when you haven't talked to the person to figure out what is going on in the first place. And keep your eye focused on the main thing. For Paul, their faith was good, and he was good because their faith was good. Look at verse 8, because verse 8 is really amazing. He says, "For now we really live if you just stand firm in the Lord." How awesome is that? Because that right there is the main thing. As long as the Thessalonians were standing firm in the Lord, that's all that mattered to Paul. He wants them committed to the Lord more than anything else. And the next sentence is really important, so important that I'm going to show it on the screen, read it once, I'm going to leave it on the screen for you to read. Ready for it? In relational uncertainty, love protects hope by focusing on what matters most. In relational uncertainty, when you're not sure where you stand with a person and you're kind of confused, are they mad at me? Do they like me? What's going on? I'm kind of sensitive. In relational uncertainty, my love for them and their love for me protects the hope that better things will be ahead. Today's a rough day between you and me, but tomorrow will be better. And the reason I believe tomorrow will be better is because I love you. And love conquers all. In relational uncertainty, love protects hope by focusing on what matters most. I want you to read that. And so I'm going to lay down my hurts and my disappointments and my unmet expectations because I love you. And I want hope for our relationship to be there. Notice Paul just wants them to stand firm in the Lord. Because if they're doing that, he knows they have everything. And notice what he says. He says, "For now we really live." Now we can be at peace. We can have joy in life. Why? Why is it? Because if they would stand firm in the Lord. Notice he doesn't say, "Well, now we can really live. Now I will have peace in my life and I will have it to the full as soon as you give me an apology. For now we really live if you'll own your part in this mess. For now we really live if you make it up to me." He doesn't say any of that. What does he say? He says, "For now we live if you're standing fast in the Lord." If you're standing firm, that's all that matters. That's the big picture. If you're at odds with somebody who's a follower of Jesus Christ, you know what will help in that relationship more than anything. Remember that you're on the same team as them. Remember that you're family. Remember that you are brothers in Christ or that you are sisters in Jesus. Remember, you're standing fast for Christ, and so are they. And that should matter more than any disagreement or any trouble that comes in the relationship. Keep the main thing the main thing. Third way to choose hope over hurt, and it's where we're going to end our time together today. See the person face to face. Verses 9 and 10. "For what thanks can we render to God for you in return for all the joy with which we rejoice before our God on your account, as we night and day keep praying most earnestly that we may see your face and make complete what is lacking in your faith." Isn't this the total opposite of the thing that we want to do when there's been some tension in a relationship that matters to us? We tend to want to avoid, kind of retreat, back off a little bit, rather than longing to see them face to face to get this thing cleared up. The idea of face to face is so important when it comes to nurturing relationships in your life. Yeah, you can text message. Yeah, you can phone call. Yeah, you can email. And those might be your only option if there's no other way to get communication across. But they all fall short in comparison to a face-to-face encounter. And when it comes to your relationship with your church family, nothing replaces face-to-face worship with one another. Nothing. As I was thinking about this idea of face-to-face, a video came to my mind that I'd seen several years ago. I want to show it to you. There's no sound to it. I think the pictures show everything. This is a baby getting glasses for the first time, and he sees his mom's face clearly for the first time. I want you to see it, the expression on his face. It gets better. Oh, he looks at her. There it is. The expression of joy when you have a face-to-face encounter with someone that you love. And I think that if Satan can divide us, if he can get us distracted, if he can distort the truth, then he's going to destroy the relationship. And we need to have face-to-face encounters with one another. What a powerful concept this is. Such a powerful concept. Paul is like, I don't think I'm going to be able to communicate everything I want to say to you in this letter, but I hope that I've said enough until I see you face to face. This morning we're going to get ready for our time decision today. And really, I'm cutting this sermon short. You may notice we didn't get all the way through chapter 3. And that's because I have about 10 more minutes left in this sermon, and this was planned. I'm going to save that for next week. Next week, we have a special visitor coming who is going to come and present a ministry to our church. And because that's going to be kind of an extended talk, I'm going to limit my portion to more of a devotional. And we're going to wrap up this week's sermon next week by giving you the fourth thing that Paul says to do when the relationships get strained. But for now, we're going to get ready to come to our time decision. And in your bulletin, you may have noticed a couple of things I just want to address real quick. First is, you now not only got one sticker. If you picked up a bulletin, there should be 2 stickers in your bulletin. Remember, last week I told you that in our video that we're getting ready to watch, it's a great reminder. It's about this guy who lives his life as an astronaut from the time that he's a boy. And every scene of his life, he's wearing this astronaut suit, kind of stumbling along in life, because Paul tells us that this world is, Peter tells us that this world is not our home, that we are strangers and aliens passing through. And in the video, this guy is dressed as an astronaut, and it shows him as a young boy, it shows him getting married, it shows him through every stage of life. And at the end of the video, it shows him getting ready to cross the bridge, and he's taking off the astronaut suit. Why? Because he's almost home. But along the way, as he's dressed as an astronaut, you know what he's doing? He's got little reminders of hope that is available to everyone who would accept Jesus Christ. And he's giving them little reminders of hope as he's living his life. And so I totally ripped the idea off from Mercy Me, but we got these stickers that I want you to take, and I want you to have one of them, but then I want you to give away one sticker to someone who you think just might need some hope. And if they look at it and like, what's this all about? You can explain it, or you can show them the video, whatever you want to do. But you remind them that hope is theirs in Jesus and that this world is not our home. Second thing that you'll notice in your bulletin is a postcard, a rather big postcard. My hope for you, get it? My confident expectation that you're going to do this. My hope for you is that you would take this, and that you would take this, and that you would be intentional, whoever it might be, a neighbor, a worker, a classmate, whatever, and who's not come to church, doesn't go to church anymore, and you take them and give this to them and say, hey, our preacher told me to do this, and just want to invite you to come to church with me next Sunday. I want you to experience some hope for your life, because Jesus makes the difference, and I think He can make the difference in your life. He's made a difference in mine. That's what I want for you to do this week. We're going to have our time decision today. I'm going to ask Mel if we can just kill some lights and ask you to stand for this one. This is the last time we're going to show this video in this sermon series, I think, unless God has other plans. But I've asked people who might be available to pray with you. If you need prayer, if you need some hope, we're going to have people available in the fellowship hall that would love to pray with you and to remind you of the hope that is yours. Hang in there a little longer. And if you have a decision that needs to be made for Jesus Christ, come talk to me this morning as I sit down here, and together we'll be reminded about the hope that is ours in Jesus.